Hi, my name is John Herreid. I work at Ignatius Press, and we're here today with Fiorella de Maria. She has written a series of detective novels, which are called the Father Gabriel Mysteries, the latest of which has just arrived in print, Death of a Scholar. So we're going to be talking to her today about her books and her creative process and just her writing in general. So welcome, Fiorella.
Well, it's lovely to be on the show again.
Yeah. So my first question for you would be, how did you kind of get into writing fiction?
Well, I've always wanted to be a writer since I was about 7. I would pay good money never to see anything I wrote before I was about 20, probably. But I always loved writing and loved writing poetry, short stories. I tried everything. I was encouraged to really experiment. And I really wanted to do it as a career, but of course it's a very difficult world to get into. I wrote the manuscript for my first novel the summer I graduated from university. I was 21 and I had it all planned out quite carefully. You know, I was going to write this this epic bestseller and then I'd probably be a really famous writer by the time I was maybe 22. It doesn't work like that, but the desire to write and create started very early, and I just feel very privileged to be able to write as a career now.
And so the types of novels that you've written so far, some I would say you would fall into the category of genre fiction, like the detective novels, and then some more into the thriller category, but some I would say are more into what you would probably call literary fiction or historical fiction.
Yeah. I'm relieved that some of them fall into the literary fiction category. That's what I most love to write. But I've always had an interest in crime fiction. I read my first Sherlock Holmes mystery far too young and scared myself to death reading The Mystery of the Speckled Band. I was waiting for a snake to come slithering onto my pillow at any moment. But I just love the puzzle, love the human interactions, the personalities involved in crime fiction. And so it was an accident waiting to happen. Eventually I was going to write my own detective, having read Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie and P.D. James, pretty much anything I could get hold of. But it was finding a detective who isn't just a stereotype. There are so many fictional detectives. Finding one who's just a little bit different was the challenge. And after that, the stories, I won't say they write themselves because there's a fair amount of blood, sweat, toil and tears, but once the character comes to life, then the whole setting sort of comes to life as well.
So that was one of the things that I thought might be interesting to kind of delve into is the character of Father Gabriel. There have been other clerical detectives like Father Brown, Brother Cadfael, and over on the Jewish side, there's Rabbi Small, of course. But there's something kind of unique about Father Gabriel. He's got a lot of quirks to his personality and his character that really make him stand out as unique. Can you kind of go into what went into conceiving of the character?
Yes, I wanted to make him an English Benedictine, partly as a nod to Brother Cadfael, who is, of course, a medieval monk, a medieval sleuth. What I found was, I loved the Brother Cadfael stories and the Father Brown stories and all the rest, but I wanted to create, as far as possible, a clerical detective who is convincingly a priest and a monk, as well as having, as you say, a quirky side to him. All detectives are a little anarchic. All fictional detectives. They're either the Sherlock Holmeses who are openly hostile to Scotland Yard, or they're the Lewises and the Morses who are policemen, but who like to just push themselves out on the edge, who are constantly in conflict with their superiors. So with Father Gabriel, the idea of him being slightly autistic, which is a thread that runs through his personality. It means he has these sometimes rather disastrous social interactions where he misreads other people's behavior, and also the way he is very obsessive when he gets an idea into his head, he can't let it go. And that's in many ways inspired by my eldest son, who is on the spectrum and has a lot of those traits. But also what I noticed, a level of innocence, that the autistic mind doesn't seek to deceive, therefore it cannot be deceived quite so easily. So with someone like Father Gabriel, he has an almost a childlike innocence to him. He doesn't like to have to tell fibs. He doesn't like to have to mislead people. But it means that other people can't deceive him because he can see through things in a very clear way. So that's where his personality really developed.
And the setting is also interesting because it's immediately post-war, and so that's the aftermath of World War II, which readers here in the United States will, of course, be familiar with 1950s Americana. It was a boom time in our economy. There was general widespread optimism, but the experience in England was very different.
Yes, I mean the detective stories are set in the late 40s, so you're not even quite getting into the 50s. I think really with Britain in the 50s, you did have the beginnings of coming out of austerity, and you had, the coronation, Queen Elizabeth. A lot of people bought their first television sets to be able to see the coronation. So that was the first time technology like that was coming into people's homes and things like that. But in the early years after the war, it was a very difficult time. You had huge austerity, rationing carried on for years after the end of the war, which a lot of people don't realise. Meat rationing, sugar rationing. So diet was pretty poor. You couldn't have lots of lovely fashions because clothing was still on coupons. There was still very much a war footing. We still had national service that carried on for quite some time afterwards. But it was also a time of huge social change, or the beginnings of huge social change. The days of imperialism were coming to an end, and the beginnings of the welfare state were starting. You had a Labour government for the first time being elected. Churchill was out. It very much felt like a new order. The beginnings of the National Health Service, all of these things, homes for heroes, all started in the 40s. So you've got a country in the late 40s that's really finding its way in the post-war world. You've got the beginnings of the Cold War threat starting to, of course, you had that in the US as well, the fear of the bomb and all of the rest. But so it was a complex time. And also you had a lot of people coming back from the war, huge numbers of refugees arriving in Britain from Eastern Europe, former displaced persons. And you had people with secrets, people trying to reinvent themselves, people trying to deal with their guilt. So it was a real cauldron of conflict, unresolved conflicts and change.
Yeah, that's one of the things that plays big into the first book in the series, where it involves people who are refugees, but carrying throughout, there are people who have a real woundedness from what they did or didn't do during the war, and how that plays upon the situations that they find themselves in.
Yes, and I think one of the things I'm really exploring in the series is that in many ways, I won't say that there are no survivors after a war, but I don't believe anyone comes out of it unscathed. There are always many, many people who may have come out in one piece, but who are going to have to struggle one way or the other with things that happened. And even though I believe the Allies were undisputedly on the right side, there were atrocities on both sides, as is explored in some of the books, and plenty of people coming home from the war with maybe things they're not so proud of, people who've been tested in ways that most people never have to experience, life and death situations, trying to save their families and all the rest. So that's really what I'm trying to explore in the books. Every book looks at a different aspect of the war, including more obscure areas like the SOE, for example, what they were doing on the home front, people who've witnessed massacres, stolen Jewish art. All of these themes come into the story.
So the latest one, Death of a Scholar, which is the one that just came out, this one, I mean, a lot of times people will typify British mysteries that are period setting as being sort of cozy, and there are certain aspects of that. But this one, I mean, there's a big connection to worldwide events that is happening in the background of this book, which brings to the forefront, what are people's responsibilities and culpability for the things that they do, even if they regard it as being an abstract sort of academic exercise. But can you kind of go into without spoiling anything, a little bit about the plot of this new novel?
I have to be so careful whenever I'm talking about a detective story that I don't give away the ending. But yes, it's looking at the collusion of scientists. And of course, I was discussing with a friend quite recently about the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, and his view was, well, we kind of had the debate afterwards. People don't really have ethical debates during wars; they just do things, and then we battle afterwards to think about whether that was really justified or not. But of course, a lot of a politician, a president, made the decision to drop the bomb, but a lot of scientists were involved in using their knowledge to create that. And there's a YouTube channel called Periodic Videos, which is it's a science series my children quite enjoy. And the professor who fronts this series talks about the fact that he's worked with plutonium. He said, well, if I had been another generation, would I have worked on the bomb, and would I have had to think about whether this was an acceptable application of science? And he said, he felt he was blessed that he wasn't a member of that generation. He didn't have to have that conversation. But of course, you don't choose when you were born. And one generation did have to think about it. So the book looks very, very closely at really collective responsibility and indirect responsibility. And of course, it doesn't just apply to scientists. We have these conversations in bioethics. If my tax money goes to fund abortion, for example, am I responsible indirectly? If my company make tools, surgical tools, which could be used in that situation, am I responsible? We constantly have these conversations, and we need to do so. I would like to say, just before I end that point, that it's set in Cambridge, and as far as I know, no Cambridge scientist was involved in the practices I describe in the book. And I feel the need to say that, just in case I seem like I'm trying to implicate my old university. That much is fictional. The setting is fictional.
And it also gets a little bit into the ethical implications of the peace movement during the war too.
Yes.
That's another aspect of the book.
Yes, I don't know how big the peace movement was in the US, because I know that obviously the US came into the war a little bit later and under slightly different circumstances. But in Britain, after the First World War, the peace movement was quite popular, as you can imagine. People reeling from an incredibly bloody conflict, which many had felt by the end was pretty futile. But as it became obvious that Hitler was going to rearm, was going to go to war, appeasement had failed, once the war started in 1939, the peace movement, I won't say it completely disappeared. There were conscientious objectors, but most people were behind the war. The majority were behind the fighting of the war. So they became very much persona non grata, and they were in some cases connected up with the fascist movement, or they were labelled as being pro-fascist because the implication was that they were siding with Hitler, which is why they didn't want a war. There were people who didn't want a war because they thought we should be friends with Germany, but many people were also sincerely pacifist. So you see in the book the way they are perceived, the very strong feelings people had about the peace union, thinking that they were traitors, feeling betrayed by them, or at the very least thinking they were, a little eccentric, and the difficulties for a young scientist who is struggling with her own ethical position.
Mm-hmm. And in the novel as well, we get to each novel, it feels like you get another peek into the backstory of Father Gabriel, like how he became the man that he is. And we gradually learn, that he is a little bit of a later vocation, and he did have a bit of a life that happened before he entered into the priesthood. So can you, without again spoiling anything, mention a
Yes.
little bit of that and his connection with Cambridge that brings him into the situation that he finds himself in the novel.
Yes, you see in the earlier novels, it is mentioned that he had a wife and a child. It's not clear initially exactly what happened, but you know, he is a late vocation and that he found his vocation under tragic circumstances. His family, his in-laws, in fact, are from Cambridge. He met his wife at university, as so many people do. And so when he goes back to Cambridge, he has to face his former in-laws. He has to face his dead wife's family, and he is not sure how they will respond to him. And you see in the midst of a book that is dealing a lot with guilt and people's struggles with guilt, his own guilt. He's convinced his in-laws will not want to accept him because they will think it was his fault. And in fact, he has a very different experience.
So I'm going to backtrack a little bit from the book back into the general detective fiction, kind of broader overview, just because I think it's interesting. But one of the things that is sort of interesting looking back over the last century or century and a half of detective fiction is how many writers of detective fiction were Christian or Catholic.
Yeah.
And you have Dorothy Sayers, you have Monsignor Ronald Knox, who wrote some of his own detective stories, which I believe he was told to stop publishing at some point. G.K. Chesterton,
Course, yeah.
Graham Greene, of course, he wrote his many great literary novels, but he also wrote genre fiction, which he called entertainments. So what do you think attracts the Christian or Catholic writer to this particular genre?
Well, I think it comes down to the search for truth and the belief in justice. And what you get in a detective story is that something terrible happens, some very heinous crime, usually murder, not always, but usually murder occurs. And a whole lot of lies and deceptions grow up around this crime. And then the detective's job is to seek the truth and to seek justice for the victim. And you see through the course of a story like that the restoration of the natural order. And of course, that is very Christian. That's very much within the moral universe of the Catholic faith.
Yeah, and it's also something that, Chesterton brings up a lot with his Father Brown stories is the idea of a priest especially being kind of finally attuned to, the repercussions of sin, because as Pope Benedict says, it's like sin is always damaging the relationship between us and others. There's no solitary sin; it always has some sort of ripple effect, and you really do see that in these in these sorts of stories.
Yes, and part of making Father Gabriel a priest meant that I could look at, when it comes to catching a murderer, obviously all detective stories are about trying to find the culprit in a situation. But of course, if the detective is also a priest, they're having to think about that person's soul. That, that actually it is always a tragedy. Someone, particularly setting the book in the series in the 40s, someone is going to hang and has to be prepared to meet his maker, having committed a mortal sin. The family of the victims are going to struggle to forgive. There's going to be all sorts of spiritual battles surrounding that crime. And that's something where the priest detective ought to be also concerned with the soul as well as the solving of the puzzle.
Yeah, the other thing that strikes me about the idea of a priest as detective is that in a certain way, and aside just from the caring for someone's soul, as priest, you inadvertently, you kind of become spiritual father to those who you are encountering, whether or not they want to accept or reject that sort of spiritual fatherhood. And a lot of the sort of awkward interactions that Father Gabriel has with people, it seems is part of it is him trying to figure out his his role in speaking to them? Like, does he address them as priest? Does he address them as just another person, especially people who come from his past life? He has a real awkwardness in talking to some of his old friends from Cambridge now that he's a priest.
Yes, and of course it's heightened by the fact that at the time, I mean, I'm not sure it's so easy now, but at the time there was still a huge amount of sectarianism and prejudice against particularly Catholic priests. So for some of his old friends, it would be very strange that he'd become a priest. They might have been able to cope with the fact that he was Catholic. They would find it very odd that he'd gone and taken the cloth. He Particularly in rural areas where people tend to be a little bit more suspicious, he's always going to be a bit of an outlier, but he's able to use that to his advantage, because being an outsider, sometimes you can look in and see things maybe you don't see when you're in the midst of it. But there's always going to be that awkwardness, because of course, in many occasions, he's talking to people who are not of the same faith, who naturally feel a little bit disdainful, quite often rather patronizing towards him. So he has to win their trust. And yet when he does win their trust, it comes quite easily.
It's an interesting observation that this is kind of an aside, but my own youngest child, his godfather is a priest who is on the autism spectrum. And he has told me before that as priest, when he gets vested or when he puts on his clerics, it's much easier for him to act as priest, because he's dressed in this way, and now he acts this role. And it's interesting that it seems like some of the awkwardness with Gabriel in this latest book, if I remember correctly, is he isn't wearing his clerics during some of it, and it makes him feel a bit odd and off.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting observation. I hadn't thought of that, but that really makes perfect sense, particularly when someone is on the spectrum. And of course, there's the added difficulty in Death of a Scholar that he's slipping back into a role where he was not a priest and where he never imagined he would be. You know, when he's talking to his in-laws, he knew them when he was a married man. And so, yes, of course, there's that very, very strange, probably strange for them as well, sort of change that has come about, which, I won't say if it's really resolved or not resolved in the book, but yes, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, as you can kind of step into a role as you vest or dress, that kind of helps you with that. But then also, one of the things that I've noticed about my own son who's on the spectrum is that situations in which he has gotten used to a certain context, it is very hard for him to readjust that context later. So I can imagine that a priest like Father Gabriel, going from the context where you described of relating to people in one manner, making an adjustment would be a very difficult thing to do.
Yes, absolutely. And it's what, I mean, I won't say that murder mysteries are ever comedies, but in some ways those moments he has, like when he's in the senior combination room and he's no idea who he's even supposed to be talking to, they do add a certain lightness to the story. You have to be able to sometimes not take yourself too seriously, and I think Father Gabriel realizes the absurdity of the situation he's in at times.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to hold up the book. I know on the podcast you can't see it, but this is the Death of a Scholar, the latest in the Father Gabriel mysteries. The previous volumes are See No Evil, Vanishing Woman, and I mentioned earlier the very first one is Sleeping Witness. But I've enjoyed reading these a lot, as not everybody may know listening to this, but I'm the series cover designer for these, and I read them cover to cover before I work on creating a book cover, and so I kind of get a preview before anybody else, and I've greatly enjoyed reading through these and coming up with ideas.
Your covers. I love your covers, John, and as I said, one day I'm going to talk to you about how you do it, because having having the need to spend 80,000 words putting out an idea, I'm intrigued by how you can take 80,000 words and put it into one picture. I think it's fascinating.
Well, it's been fun because I did try to take the inspiration of the novels of that time and come up with something that looked like it could have been printed back then. So
Yeah.
in the late 1940s, early 50s graphic design style. So as a design nerd, it was fun.
Well, actually, I liked what you did with this thing of darkness, with the whole the creepy face.
Oh yes. That was the other recent novel co-authored with K.V. Turley, which is on Bela Lugosi, which is, people should look that one up too. This Thing of Darkness.
This Thing of Darkness. Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. And are there any upcoming projects that we should be aware of?
Well, I've recently contributed a book to the Vision series on Maximilian Kolbe, Hero of the Holocaust, which was wonderful to have the privilege to write, and hopefully another coming out next year. So watch this space.
Yeah. So the Vision series for the Father Gabriel series, of course, is not for children, but the Vision series is for children, and the story of Maximilian Kolbe, Saint Maximilian Kolbe, is a really wonderful one. And so if you have kids between the ages of 9 and 14, you should definitely look that one up too. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been lovely.
Hope we can talk to you again soon.